new flexibility. So with that, Daniel, I'll hand it over to you. Can't wait to see what we can do with SVGs, having played around with them myself for the last week and a bit.
Okay, so I'm good to share my screen.
You are.
I think we'll do that. So I'm off in the corner somewhere. Okay, that should be coming through for everybody.
Oh, that's nice.
The sadly, the production values don't improve from here, unfortunately. So yeah, as Jeff said, I sort of had a very short window to turn something around. So this is we're going to figure this out as we go. So I've got it planned. I haven't really timed it. It should be good. Jeff, you may need to prod me with a stick if it's taking too long. But here we go. So this is just a bit of fun. So did you know you can do SVG backgrounds on the canvas in Power BI, and you can animate SVGs as well. So you can do silly things like this. So that's just a bit of fun. And obviously you can drop Henry in there with some lovely sunglasses on as well. For those who don't know me, see, I told you the production values really go downhill now. That was just it. That was all the sizzle right there. So if you don't know me, I'm Daniel. I'm a data platform MVP based down in Canterbury, New Zealand. I am mostly dabbling in visuals in Power BI these days. My background is mostly in the back end of modeling, but I've gradually transitioned into visuals, mostly just because I want to improve their capabilities. So I write a lot of custom visuals for the marketplace, and there's 4 that I currently maintain. So there's Deneb, which we've done a presentation on before, the violin plot, HTML content, and my first one, which is a small multiple line chart. But I love tinkering with visuals in Power BI, and this is kind of why I've got into SVG. SVG is an image format, really, that's a bit more versatile than, you know, if you look at an image under the hood, it's binary data. So it's really hard to do stuff programmatically with it. What's really nice about SVG is it's like an XML based format. So this is the documentation that I've brought up this is the MDN pages. So if you do any kind of web development, this is usually your Bible for that kind of thing. They document everything. So HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and SVG, which is a really large subset. So if you need to refer to things, this is where you usually start. But just on the left, we've got a lot of elements we can use. And we're not going to really dive into this deep today. That's kind of the thing I'm trying to say. We're going to take you on a journey. And the journey this is quite a deep subject in Power BI because of how you have to make it work. So we're going to try and start out gently. We're going to move through into some examples that are workable and practical. And I'm going to try and do it as best I can. But in visual development, you start to maybe appreciate why visuals are so hard to do well. So that's my disclaimer. It's a very versatile framework. So there's a gazillion ways to do everything, just like there is with DAX and development in other languages. So what I'm going to present to you is what I think are patterns that will hopefully work well, but they're not definitive design patterns. They're ways I've learned to do things that have benefited me, and they prevent a number of gotchas, things that trip you up when you think about data and how you need to present it. I'm also really, really terrible at DAX, honestly. Everyone's got an area that they're probably not that great at, and DAX isn't mine. And DAX is definitely not an area I'm good at. So I've done stuff. You will probably see better ways to do it. I'm very, very keen to hear about that, but perhaps not while we're talking. But please, if you see something that I can learn from, feel free to reach out and let me know. Okay, so we're putting you in control of the canvas as well. And I just hinted at that a few minutes ago, but you have to draw everything. This is the downside. The advantages are numerous. The downsides are also that you've got to draw everything. But we'll get you into it first and see what you think. Don't want to put you off, just managing your expectations. So as I said, SVGs are an image format. The way they work is they will load into a web page or Power BI, which is a web-based canvas of its own, just like any other picture. So I built this lovely star in a tool called Inkscape, which is an open source tool that you can use to design SVG in a more graphical user interface type manner. So just quickly got this out and drew it. So this is a simple SVG shape. Now this looks like an image. Underneath, I'll just zoom that in a bit.
The packages.
Oh, somebody saying something there?
Maybe we can potentially
Okay. Under the hood, it looks like this. So instead of it being binary data, it's very similar to HTML, and this is actually XML. So if you're familiar with XML, it's like a little tree of tags that open and close, and you can put stuff in them. So what this is saying is, this is an SVG document. We're creating what's called a path object, which is one of the most complicated objects you can use, and we've got a fill color and a stroke, which is the border around it. It's 0.3 wide, and this little fellow here is the attributes to move the cursor around. So what this is actually doing is drawing a star, and then it's moving it along a plane. And the result is you get, where's it gone? I zoomed it in. Same website, same settings. You get this star. So you can very easily find SVGs online. You can draw them yourself very easily. So to begin with, whilst you have to program everything up, you can start with something that you may be familiar with. So that's quite nice. Now, what we need to do is to get this into Power BI somehow. So what's happened in Power BI all the time is we've had a table visual. And what we can do, I'll bring my tabular editor up. I spent all this time sorting it out. What we've got here, hopefully is that coming through, Jeff?
It is. Lovely.
So what I would suggest is,
and for people at home who are watching this on Teams, if it's a bit small, you can control and zoom in. I'm not sure if you can do it. Oh, you can do it in the web client too. That's great. So yeah, if you can't see anything, just hold down Control Zoom and then drag with your cursor, and you can move things around. Yeah, regrettably, the DAX editor in Power BI is workable for these things, but it's very hard to show you things side to side. So what I'm doing here is I'm putting Tabular Editor on the screen so that we can see the DAX that we're working on. And then we've got a table that's on the other half of the screen so we can sort of show the output much more easily. So what I'm starting here is, this is a base measure that I would use. So when you load an image through the internet, you might put HTTP or HTTPS in front of the path to the image, and you can load it from a website. What you can actually do is you can use something called a data URL. And what you can actually do is use this format here to specify an embedded link. So what I mean by that is we can put an image inside the document of our page that isn't loaded from another location. It's actually in our document, and we can encode that as it is. So with a PNG image or a JPEG image, this would be like binary data. But with SVG, we can actually specify it's an SVG image and it's XML based, and we can put that into a measure. So what I've got here is I've got this simple measure here, SVG base. I put this preamble at the front, and then I put a simple SVG tag. And then what I've just put is, this is a comment. So I'm just putting this in to illustrate where we would start putting things. And then all I'm going to do is return that back out. So if I want to add this in to my table visual, we basically get what's in here. So with tables, what we need to do is we can actually render images in tables. And the way we do that in our data model is we can change the data category. So if it's a valid image, you can make it an image URL. So instead of a web URL, which is like a hyperlink to a page, you can actually say this is supposed to behave as an embedded image. And if we click that, it suddenly goes blank. Now, if I hover the tooltip, I can see that I've still got that content under there, but I've now got this blank thing. And that's because there's nothing happening in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to another one. And this is the star that we just saw. So what I've done is I've used that same pattern and I've copy pasted that in. Now, the only thing I have done with SVGs, often they like to use double quotes. And because we're using a double quote for our measure, because we have to make this a big long text value, using a double quote will break that out. So if I put a double quote, you can see it starts to break my output. Now, the way I usually work with that is single quotes are fine within HTML and SVG. So what I usually do is I take the SVG and I replace the single quotes, double quotes with single quotes. But what you can also do is put two double quotes inside a text value in DAX to what we call escape it. So that's another way around it if you prefer the double quotes. Let's just get it back to how it was, because there's some more complicated measures coming and we need the room. Okay, so this is the star. And this is the corresponding measure in Power BI, and I'm going to change that to an image URL. And what's going to happen now is any of the future measures we demonstrate, I've already done this to save time.
if I go to the table, get rid of that measure out of the way and get the DAX editor out of the way, I'm just going to remove the base. Actually, no, I'll put the other one in. If I add that in, I now get my image. I can see that I've got my content, which is really good. And the way we handle this in the table is under the properties for a table or matrix visual, we've got this image size option. And until recently, we only had the ability to control the height. And until that point, images had to be square. So right now, this is 150 by 150. I can make it 125 by 150, and it still appears square, but we can see the box sort of is more rectangular. Let's make it more like 50 by 150. There we go. So we can see that we've actually got this gray area where the visual can exist. Now, there were some people back in 2018 that had figured this system out, and they were doing some pretty cool stuff. One of which being David Eldersveld, who is always doing cool stuff. And he built this example here to produce sparklines inside a Power BI table. And you can see this is the same technique, but the problem was that they still appeared to be square. We couldn't really condense them down. So every table had this huge amount of white space. So we didn't get any, we got some value out of it, but we had to take the downsides. So what we can do now, because we've got the ability to control width and height, is we can take advantage of that. So what that means is a lot of charts that we might want to build with this thing, we can change the height and the width to make them appear more charty rather than more square. So this is a simple example, but we can start to work on that. And we'll get to that in just a moment. I'm just going to stick with the simple one for now, because what I want to try and do is explain how we can start working with DAX, or at least my limited knowledge of DAX. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this extra measure up here on the left. And what I've done, I'm just going to move to another page as well. I've got a slicer here with some color values that I've predefined. So I've got named colors, because in the web and CSS, we can have named colors. We can have hexadecimal valued colors, and we can also have hexadecimal with an extra segment that does transparency. We can also use red, green, blue, and red, green, blue, and alpha values. So these are all bindable. The goal here is what we want to do is to try and change the star based on this value. So we've got a simple measure called selected color, which will take the value and bind it to the star. And all we're really doing is we're going down to our SVG and we're adding that variable in. So where the fill attribute is, we've got to make sure the single quote remains there, because when it gets rendered, it still needs to be valid. Now, if we took that out and we save the changes, that's broken. So what that means is there's an image that isn't valid. That's what Power BI and your web browser will do. So we always need to make sure it's valid. So it's not exactly the most fun, but this is the rules we have to play with. The other one we've done is I've got a parameter in here for stroke width, which is the width of the line. And I've made that 100% 1.0 through to 0, and I'm doing the same thing. So this is just showing you that you can start to bind measures quite easily to this stuff. You can make some dynamic visuals very, very easily by taking an existing design, and you can bind conditions to it through a measure and start to do some fun stuff. All right, just furiously checking my notes. Sorry, I've just got to make sure that I'm staying on track. Okay. So this is all very exciting. But what we want to start thinking about is how can we start making fun charty kind of things. So I'm going to start with some simple ideas and build them up. The reason being is because the more stuff we want to do, the harder it gets and the more things we have to think about. So I'm going to start with a very simple example and we're going to build it up throughout today. And then we'll show some more aspirational examples at the end. So our first example is we're just going to do a simple, we've still got our SVG pattern. All we're doing is we're putting a simple rectangle shape inside, and that's here. We've got the simple square rectangle. Now, what I'll mention, our image size is set to 130 by 150 wide. Currently, the parameters don't let us go over 150. And it doesn't let us go below 24. So at the minute, we're constrained to work within those confines. So unfortunately, the footprint isn't massive, but that's quite nice for tables. but it does limit our creativity a little bit. Hopefully that will change. But for now, I'm going to leave it as 30 by 150. So what this is to do is to demonstrate how much space we have within that table cell. What we've done here is we've added a width and a height attribute, and we've set those to 100%. And what that's saying is stretch it to fit the container, the SVG container, stretch the rectangle to fit 100% of the width and 100% of the height, fill it in this very light gray, and give it a stroke of a slightly darker gray. So we can change that up if we like. We'll just change it to, say, slightly lighter one, or even a darker one. And we get a darker border. So we can start to play around with things. And if we change the height and width, so I could change that to, say, 75, we can see that because we've specified using width and height of 100%, this will stretch to fit. So rectangles are quite cool because we can use percentages. Now, percentages aren't usable in everything. So we're going to use this for illustrative purposes, but we're going to move beyond percentages shortly. But this is just to show you how you can start thinking about drawing inside this canvas. So what we want to do now is demonstrate the coordinate system of SVG. So I've got another measure here. And all I'm going to do, I'll put it side by side or underneath, because this is actually a matrix, so the measures go downwards. This is a rectangle that we've got before, and we've drawn a circle. And there's a circle element here. And what we've said is put the center X attribute at 50% and put the center Y at 50% and make the radius 3%. So we can change the radius to, say, 10%, and it will grow. And obviously we could bind that if we wanted. This is really just to illustrate the coordinate system. So with charts that we know, and not all charts, but most what we call Cartesian charts, the two-dimensional charts, the bar charts, the line charts, the X will run from left to right, and the Y will run from bottom to top. Now with SVG, because you got to think of SVG as a piece of paper, a chart is a construct in a 2D canvas. It's not, you're still drawing it. And that's what we have to remember. So there's things that we have to think about, like axes and scaling and all this kind of stuff that we now have to start doing the work on. Now with SVG, the coordinate system goes left to right for X, just like we expect, but it goes top to bottom. So if you think about our value of sales, if we're looking at that, the higher value of sales would be here. The lower value would be here. It would be inverted. So this is something we have to think about. Now I can sort of show you a little bit more by taking, I could maybe make this CX 10%, and that would move it to the left. And if I made the CY 0%, actually, let's make it 10%. It'll push it up to the top. So if we think about 10% being smaller, normally with, say, a bar chart or a line chart, we'd want it the other way around. But this is how the coordinate system works. So when we start to move through examples, these are the kind of things that we have to think about to start producing charts that using this system. Okay. Now with our third example, I'm just going to get rid of these two just to keep the focus on the right area. So this is a simple example where what I'm going to try and do now is use that idea of a rectangle to draw a simple data bar. So I'm using some static values. So what I'm saying is my minimum value is 0, because with bars, with bar charts, we have to think about, and this is something you have to do now, is you have to think about how to display bars honestly and correctly. Bars always should start at 0, or if they're negative, that's a different case, but they should always have the same relative length. You shouldn't cut bars off because it's not really fair to show increase or decrease between series. So what we're setting here is we're just saying for our X value, so we're going to do the bar across. We start at 0. And we set our maximum value at 75. So in our heads, we have a hypothetical measure that could be 75. So we're thinking about our axis here. This is a proxy for our axis. Our axis starts at 0 and it ends at 75. At the minute, we're just hard coding these in. Now, what we need to do, even though I'm not doing this yet, we need to think about the span of our axis. So at the minute, it's 0 to 75, but it could be negative values. We're not going to mess with that just yet. We'll get to that in a moment. But just keep that in your back pocket for now. We're going to create a value that I would call a test measure, and that's 50. So we're assigning that to a variable called X value. And then what I need to do is I need to work out the position of that. So when I talk about position, what I mean is the physical position on the page. So when we talk about measure values, those are what we would call logical values. They're the things we read and understand about our data, but those have to be converted into a physical space on our screen. So what we have to do is we have to convert what we know about our canvas to scale for those values. And because I'm sticking with percentages down here, I'm just going to do a simple division of the value by the maximum value, which is 75. And then I can just times it by 100 because that's easy for us to convert. Normally with percentages, we might work with decimal values from 0 to 1, but for the minute, we're just going to keep it so that it fits with this 0 to 75. And because we're using 100% as our height and our width, it's going to make sense. What I've got here is the rectangle we had before, and that's to illustrate the available space. And then underneath, I've got a rectangle that binds the width attribute to that positional value that we calculated. So if I now add this to the canvas, I've got my rectangle in the background, whoops, just to show how much space we've got. And we've got our second bar here that's drawn on top of it. So what I should note is with SVG, the order in which you put stuff in is the order in which it gets drawn. So for those of you that are familiar with HTML or other languages, even in Power BI, the concept of what they call a Z order. So like in PowerPoint or Power BI, you can send things backwards or forwards yourself. That isn't the case here. You have to draw in the order that you intend. So the highest up is drawn first. So our gray rectangle you can see is underneath our black rectangle. Now, if we change our maximum value, we could change that to 100. All of our calculations are going to work. So you can see now that our bar takes half the space because it's 50 out of 100. If we change our X value to 10, it takes up 10% of the space. We could make it 90. And our measure is doing the work for us. So we're keeping this pattern and we're just starting to evolve it very, very slightly. But what we have to think about is for any measure value, we have to scale it to fit. And because we're using percentages, this is really easy because we just need to know how many percentage does that measure take out of what we've assigned for it. Where it gets difficult, as we talked about above, is what happens if we make the axis negative. So if we, for some reason in our visual, we had negative values, if I set that to -20, it doesn't really look any different. And the reason is because we've always said that it's the width is the positional value. So it's always going to start from here. We haven't specified its X coordinate. So there's a Y coordinate that puts it 30% of the way down to put it in the middle. But the X coordinate, it doesn't have it, so it starts it from the left. So the next step is, if we want to make this safe for negative values, we then have to start thinking about this span. So I'm going to hop across to this measure now. Whoops. And what I've done is I've already set up a -50 to 75 scale. The difference now is I'm going to use this span variable. So I'm going to take away 75 minus -150, which is going to make us, negative minus negative is a positive. So it's going to make the axis bigger in terms of the number of units that are available. So if it's -50 to 75, if my math is right, we're going to get 125 units, I hope, on our chart. Because the canvas doesn't know about negative values, we can't easily say negative because it pushes it off the area we can't see. So what we have to do is create the necessary scaling to make it work. And this is where we're thinking about coordinates and locations on the physical part of our canvas. So we're doing the same thing, except now we're dividing the span by 100. So we're dividing 100 by 125. So that's going to tell us how many percent of width each unit of our axis takes up. So it's going to be less than 1%, but it's still going to be correct. What we then need to do is think about where 0 occurs. Because 0 now occurs theoretically, I'm going to take a guess, but about probably here. So we need to think where that is so that we know where to draw a rectangle from. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our scale and we're going to multiply it by the value we're interested in, which is 0. minus the minimum value. And that's going to give us where 0 sits on that range. So that percentage helps us to work out how many units along 0 actually is. It's not 0 in the physical sense, but the logical sense is further along. And then we have to think about 0 may not be our lowest value. So our bar is negative, but all of our bars could be positive. So we may not have a problem. Our bars may be positive, but they may be negative. So what we then need to think about is what I would call the x1 and x2 coordinates. So x1 being where the rectangle starts and where the rectangle ends, the x2. And the reason we think about that is because, again, we can't do negative widths. So if one's lower than the other one, it has to be the right way around, because a negative width rectangle is invisible to us. And because rectangles don't have x1 and x2, which would be lovely. So for those of you that have used Fagerlight and Deneb, rectangles have an x1 and x2, but those guys do the conversion for you, and they actually turn it into a width attribute. So what we have to then do is take away the highest value from the lowest value, and that's going to give us the calculated width based on our scale. So now this is a little bit bigger. So what I've done is I've kept that original rectangle. What I'm doing is I'm putting in an origin marker just so that we can check our work. And this uses a line that does have x1 and x2, and we want to put that at 0 because we want to show where our 0 line is. We run the y from 0% to 100%, so that's from top to bottom, so that we can see it across a whole plane, just so that we know it's definitely there, and we're making it 2 pixels wide so that we can definitely see it. Then our data bar is underneath, and the only thing we've done differently is we've added an x, so that we start from the x1 value, which is the lowest value of either 0 or the negative value, if that exists, if our measure is negative, and then the width is that calculated value. So that's a lot to take in, but this is the kind of stuff that you have to think about when you want to make cool looking data stuff. So if I add this to the canvas now, I can see that I've got my origin line. We'll talk about tooltips in a bit. Bear with me. So we've got our origin line, which shows where 0 is, and we've got our data bar, which is going in the right direction because our measure value is currently 30. So if we make that minus 30, it now moves it the right way, because now minus 30 is the lowest value of 0 and minus 30. So we now know that we've got to use that value, and 0 is now our highest value because minus 30 is lower than it. And we can change our scale. So if we wanted to, make that minus 70 to 0, let's make it 5 just for fun. Then it's going to scale it the right way. And we can see now that we have a mostly negative value, but we can still see it relative to 0. And that value could be minus 60, and it will scale it correctly. So this is a pattern that helps us to start to understand, yes, we've got measure values, but we have to think how we space them on the canvas. And because we don't know how big our canvas is, this is the kind of thing we have to think about. So hopefully that makes sense. And we can sort of see what happens if we take this into consideration. So whilst I am thinking about the stuff that might trip us up, it's a good thing to have in mind, because you might start to see unpredictable results if you're trying to make this work yourself. Right. How are we doing for time, Jeff?
We're doing well. You're doing great, mate.
This is good. This is good to know. So next, we're going to actually do something that's not static. So what I've done here is I've created a table, and I'm just using the simple financial data set that comes with Power BI, by the way. I've made it into a dimensional model, a star schema. But this is the data that exists with, you just click, give me some sample data. Unless you've replaced it, this is what you'll get. It's a little old now, but it's okay. Hopefully it's universally known. So we're going to consider categories now. And this is where, we're going to do two things. We're going to start to bind a measure and do that thing we did, but with measures. But we also need to start thinking about the rest of our data, because a bar that only knows about itself is a pretty useless bar. Every bar is just going to be the same length, because if Canada doesn't look outside and look at France and Germany and Mexico, the width of our bar is always going to be the same all the way down, and it's going to be not really very useful data. The nice thing about bars is that they give us a really quick way of comparing things visually, because we're very good at comparing length. relative to other lengths. And that we can't do that if we're not thinking about the rest of our data. So I'm adding another measure here. And what I'm doing is I'm taking the x-axis domain stuff that we set up, which was fixed at -70 and 5. But what I have to do is start using DAX, which hurts my brain, makes me sad. But I have to think in my categories, I could have, 0 or 1 or many. So what I have to do is look at the minimum value of 0 as opposed to the minimum value of all of the current values for country for my measure. So I'm getting my minimum by traversing this table that you see in DAX land, and I'm getting the lowest value out of 0 and the measure. So again, I may, and the reason we do that is because 0 is important to us with bars. We do the same with max, which is basically the inverse. We just flip it to max and do a max x, which traverses the table. It's a table iterative function in DAX, and that gives us the highest value of sales across our country. So if I add the sales measure, which will probably help very much, we can see that the US has the highest sales, and we can sort by sales, and Germany's got the lowest. By sorting, it's very, very easy. But what we're doing in this DAX is we're basically going across this and just making sure we've got the highest and lowest values so that when we draw the bars, we know what we're doing. So our span remains the same. We did that before. Our X value is now mapped to the sales measure. So for every row context, this is going to evaluate to that value without any additional modifiers or filter context changes. The scaling is the same. We're dividing the span by 100 because we're still working with percentages. We're working out the position of 0. This hasn't changed either. We're calculating the value of X. Now, what we did before was very, very similar. You see, we use 0 for the 0 position, and we use the measure for our live value. That hasn't really changed. Shouldn't jump around so much because tabular editor puts me back at the top. We do the same thing here, so this hasn't changed. We have to keep it, obviously, because DAX isn't very functional, which is a shame because I'm a very functional person. I don't like to repeat my code, but unfortunately, in some cases, we have to, particularly with tables in DAX, which is a bit of a shame, but never mind. I don't think people envisage using DAX for this travesty that we're using it for, but it's very, very useful. So the design pattern is the same. All we're doing is having to be a bit more aware of our additional rows in our table. So we haven't changed much, but we have changed a bit. Now, if I add this other measure in, which if I've done it correctly, it's this. I'll just collapse those previous ones down so I don't get lost. So 1. We've now got our origin line, as we can see it on the 0, and we've now got these bars that are calculating correctly because we're now saying, well, our span is based on the US, and we now know how it should size. So we get this really nice relative bar with an origin line. So it's quite a simple use case, but it's quite cool. One thing I will do, actually, because I think time is going a little better than I thought. Sales sorts very nicely because it's a number. SVG is text underneath. So when we try and sort it, it doesn't always go to plan because stuff doesn't, because why would it? That's life. But there's a neat little trick you can do, and I'll put this in. Because SVG is XML based, XML is extensible. That's what the X in XML stands for. It's kind of like how the X in DAX stands for analysis or analytics. We can actually add attributes that don't necessarily have a bearing on the output as long as they're not part of the language. So we could add in a sort attribute that doesn't really exist in SVG. And we can add in, I'm just going to put a placeholder while I finish typing this out because doing both talking and typing live is hard. Now, what I might do here is I might add a format. And what I want to try and do is make sure that my number is text safe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort my X value. And I'm just going to give it a really long format string with lots of padded zeros because that's a crazy high number. So what this is going to do is force that into that's going to appear above everything else in the text that tries to sort, that Power BI tries to sort. Now we've got this. It's going to be hard to see. Let's see if we can find it. There it is. So that's the lowest value because that's the thing that gets sorted first. So now we can actually sort that just like we could any other column.
So Daniel, can I ask a question on that? So that word sort, it could be any word. You could say Jeff in there.
Yeah, it could be whatever you like. Well, it can be anything that's not in the SVG language.
Excellent. And so Power BI just throws out anything that it doesn't care about in the text string that this is returning.
Yeah. So what you got to think about is I'll just get rid of this for a minute. This part of Power BI here is basically a web page. This is why the service and Power BI is so compatible. So, you know, things like visuals we build, as long as they respect the rules of HTML, CSS, JavaScript for custom visuals, but for images, as long as it's valid, it will work. It gets ignored. If SVG doesn't know about it, it gets ignored. And yes, Maxim is correct. You can put an sorting text at the start as well. But it depends how you're building your SVG. The reason it would work for this one, but if you're building a, we'll show you one a little bit later where that wouldn't work, because yeah, but you've got to think about what your use case is and how it will work. But absolutely, you could put something right at the front, as long as it's valid SVG.
Fantastic.
And as I say, I'm not. There's so many ways to do stuff, so I'm not telling you the definitive way. I'm just giving you the stuff I've learned the hard way. But by all means, if there are better patterns, go for it. And I would love to hear about them because there's some really creative people out there and they're already doing great stuff. So what we need to think about now is bars work nicely with percentages, but not every shape in SVG supports percentages. So what we need to start thinking about are pixels, ideally, because that's a more universal way of making things work. So if we want to move on to things like lines and so on, we have to think about that absolute positioning based on the calculated pixel values. Now, there are things you can do that I'm not going to talk about today. So there's a concept called a view box in SVG where you can actually set out a coordinate system that scales differently to the physical dimensions. We may see that a bit later if I get time to show one more example, but I'm not going to touch ViewBox too much today. What I'm trying to show is the thinking involved. So yes, you can shortcut it with ViewBox, and I have done, but this is just to help you start thinking about how to scale and work in this domain. So this one is a different measure with the same result. So let's just let's get that down there because I've got these really long measure names, which you can change, obviously. So this gives us the same result, but we've converted it to pixels rather than percentages. This one won't sort though, because I didn't make that change. What we will do, we now start needing to add our physical width that we wish to take up. So I've added a variable called width, and I've made that 150 because that matches my image size. And SVG can be forgiving, but I would generally say, if you're going to start using these pixel values to do calculations, make sure these correlate because it just makes it easier to debug things. So what I'm going to do now is instead of using a percentage, I'm going to divide the width instead of 100. So instead of using percent, I'm just going to use width. So 150 is now my numerator that I'm using. So 150 pixels across. And all we're doing is the same thing. We're converting it into units and we're working out how many pixels a unit of data takes. And that's really the difference. The only thing we've really changed is instead of percentages for our X and Y values, I've kept the percentage the same for the Y because we're not doing anything in that space. But I would probably convert that to, what is it, 24? I'd make that 24 just for consistency. And I might make that a variable higher up as well so that I can change it, but I'll leave it as 100 for now. But everything else, we've just taken the percentage units off. So you can see where X is. If we jump back to the previous one, we had a percent that we added on, for each of these attributes. We've taken that away. And now we've basically got, if I pull this up, we've got 0, 0, 0, 0, 150 for this bar because it's the furthest bar because it's the US. If we look at one that's a little more variable, we've got 142.689 because that's how Canada scales to the US. So it's a slight change, but it's a change that will help us if we wish to move into other shapes. I mean, obviously, if you want to use percentages for bars, go nuts. It is technically easier, but it's just something that I'm giving you to help understand the SVG canvas and how to start thinking in scales. Now, let's get rid of this one. Now, the other thing I'm going to do is explain the Y version of that. So instead of a bar, we'll make a column. We're doing the similar thing. We're calculating instead of the x-axis, it's the y-axis now. So we're getting the minimum maximum value across all of our row contexts just like before. I've just renamed the variables though, that's all, but they're the same thing. We're calculating the span, so we know the distance. We're getting our measure value. I've put our height in at 24, which is not very exciting. It's not going to show much variance. So I'm actually going to, if you can forgive the table for now, I'm going to turn that to 150. And I'm going to make the height 150. And those bars are going to look scary. But that's because we're using a 30% height on that one. Let's hide it. Stare me in the face. So the height is now 150. Our scale is the same. The only difference now, when we calculate the position of any measure, we have to take the height into consideration. So instead of, with X, it starts from 0. So we could use the scale times our measure minus the minimum value. We now have to subtract that from the height so that it inverts it the correct way. So everything else is the same. If I save that measure and I add it to the table, this is much harder to compare. So maybe we will change. No, forget it. I can't be. No, let's just not worry about it. We can see what it's doing. We can see there are some differences in the bar because of the white space. Now, if we didn't do the height, the bars would be weird. They're actually being pushed down, so we're not really seeing them. So what we have to do is to think about, if our axis starts at the bottom, we have to invert it and take it away so that it scales correctly. So we're not going to do much with column charts. Actually, tell a lie, we're going to do this exact thing now. So this is what I'm just trying to get you in the mindset for, because now we're going to have a look at producing a Spark bar chart. So we'll be, hello.
If you could just change that setting back so the bars were pushed down again for a moment.
Yep.
And I think the point you're making is that once we see it, is that
that's actually the right way. They're hanging. You can see they're hanging.
Yeah, so I think the point is that the bars are actually still behind the scenes the same length. It's just that some of them's been pushed off the little canvasy bit, right?
Yeah, because the height is wrong. So it may be correct depending on how it works out. I'd have to debug it, but I'd be expecting the bar to be something like that. Yeah. So that's what we have to think about. The canvas clips, basically. So the limits of the canvas will clip anything. And you can get pretty clever with SVG and you can start clipping shapes within the canvas, but read the doc, it's fun. There's loads of things you can do in SVG. But this is the principle. So now we're going to have a look at, I'm moving to product rather than country now, just because the countries are too close together in the data. So I want to show a bit more variability. So what I'm setting up here is I've just got a simple slicer for year so we can see what our sales measure does. And I've already kind of preempted a question that Jeff may have or has already figured out. I've seen his tweets, but this is quite an important thing with sparklines that we don't get currently with the built-in ones. So when we talk about comparison, we want to make sure that we can look at series relative to other series. So the option of, I've added a simple table and I've created a measure that just looks at that slicer and returns a 1 or a 0. So if we choose synchronized, it's 1. If it's independent, it's 0. and we assume it's synchronized if nothing's selected. I've got a single select on my slicer, but this is just going to give us a 1 or a 0 value, and this is going to factor into what we're going to do next. So we're building on the principles for the Y scaling, but we're adding in an extra complication now. It gets fun. And because I suck at DAX, it's probably way easier to do, but the principle, the walkthrough approach is the same. You would probably make the DAX better, but the checkpoints that we're going to go through are the same. Now, if some of you have used tools in JavaScript for web development like D3, D3 is a really great JavaScript library that takes a lot of this out of your hands. So it will draw, it does many things, but what it does really well particularly is positioning SVG based on data. You give it your physical dimensions and your data ranges, and it works this out for you. We're having to do this in DAX because we don't have access to libraries or functions. Wouldn't it be cool if we did? But anyway, that's tough. We don't. So what I'm doing first is I'm setting up my width and height here. So I'm going to assume 150 by 24, and I'm just going to check that. Yep, that's cool. That's all done. Now, what I like to do is I like to put what I call my aesthetic properties for my marks at the top. So a mark being a data point, something representing a data point. Now, if those of you that are familiar with Deneb or Charticulator or Tableau, marks are shapes that are bound to data. So I kind of keep that vocabulary in mind. So what I'm saying here is I'm going to put a white stroke around the box to give it the illusion of space from the others. I'm going to make that 0.5 pixels. What's cool about SVG is you can actually use decimal values for this stuff. So if 1 is too small, sorry, if 1 is too big and 0 is too small, obviously, you can slide it between that. Now, you do have issues with certain monitors don't necessarily work well with the edges of pixels. There are settings you can put into the SVG container or a shape to anti-alias it or work that out for you. We're not going to worry about that today. So you may see some artifacts depending on how this produces, but don't worry too much about it. What I'm going to do is I'm grabbing that sync axis value. So that's going to be 1 or 0. Now, because I take this into consideration, I need to think about not just my current category, which is product, but I also need to think about all of the grain of the data. So with my product, I'm gonna have a month value. For each bar, it's gonna be a month. So sorry, 1 bar per month. Let's work that out better. So if I put my date table, I have a month start attribute, which is just the first of the month. So I'm going to get 1 row per month start per product. But what I need to do, because I've got to find out what the highest bar is across all of that, I've got this delightful piece of DAX here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to summarize the table by date and product. I'm going to take the product filter away so that in my current row context, and someone will tell me there's a way better way to do that. And then I'm going to grab my measure, and my measure value is sales. So this is just a way of getting a table for every combination so that I can use that for my deduction of which is the biggest bar. Now, one thing I need to start thinking about, what we haven't done yet is we haven't drawn multiple things. So we need to think about our categories. So each category in this series, actually, let's call, we'll call it a category just because that's how it's been commented. But so if we call product the series and the month is the category, what we need to do is find the minimum and maximum category value. And what we want to do is we still want to traverse the whole table because some series may have blank values. But what we want to do is find the earliest value that doesn't have a blank value, because in our financial data set, there's a whole bunch of dates that just don't have data in from the financials table, and they would just jam up the chart. So this is just a way of saying, out of that data, find me the very first one that has a number and find me the last one that has a number. And then filter that all rows and categories and get all the unique values of month start that fall between those dates. So that's just going to give me, if I'm on 2014, it's basically going to give me January through December. If I'm in 2013, based on the financial data, it's going to give me September to December because that's where the measure starts accruing values. So these are just things you have to think about because each series may be different, but with scaling, with axes, they have to line up. And if you don't think about that, you're going to get all kinds of weird size bars, and they're not going to line up, and you're not going to be able to compare them. So these are the kind of things you have to think about. Now, a tool like D3 will just give you a scale, the little values in, which is great, but we don't have that. The other thing we need to do is to think about our spacing of our bars along the x-axis. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to get the count of rows from that categories table. So that's basically the number of unique months that are in there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to calculate how much width each category takes up. So I'm going to divide the total width, that 150 pixels, by the category count. And then what I then need to do, because I got all the data, I'm just going to get the current row context, and all I'm just going to filter it down to the current. So it would be Amarilla if we're looking at that one, Caratera if we're looking at that one. This just gives me my categories, and we just make sure we sort them correctly based on date, because we need them to plot in the right order. It's likely they will be, but sometimes data may not come out in the order in which you think. And again, if your bars don't line up, that might be why. Now, with the y-axis, we're doing that thing we just did. We're working out the maximum and minimum values. The only difference we've done now is we've put an if statement in to say if we're syncing the axis, use all of the data. And if we're not, just use the data set for the current row. So that's just getting the measure value, which is sales for that particular scenario. So that's the same thing we did, just extended. Our span is the same. We're still calculating we're doing the scale. We're dividing the height by the span. And we're doing the zero positioning so that if we have negative values, that's covered. What I'm doing now is I'm going to calculate, I'm creating a table called primary positions. So what I'm doing there is I'm looking at my data set, and I'm going to create a y value that does that calculation that we did before on a row by row basis. So I'm going to get the height, I'm going to take away the scale times the measure minus the minimum, and that gives us our y position for each row. And then the other thing I need to do is work out the physical x position where that bar gets put. So I'm going to use the x order, which starts from 0 up above here. Should have really gone into that in a bit more detail. We rank the categories and we take 1 off it because SVG starts at 0. So we don't have pixel 1 is actually 1 across. So 0 is the first pixel. So we create an order that matches that, so that when we project it out, 0 times width, make sure it puts the bar right on the left for the first one. And then it makes sure that we multiply by the category width to move the next one across. What I then like to do is create a little table where I add my dynamic attributes. So I'm going to take that primary positions table where I've got my y value that's been worked out and my x value that's been worked out, and I'm going to add the y1 and y2. So that was the same as doing the minimum and maximum. I'm just going to add those in. Now, this is where things get a bit different. So we're going to produce a table called marks, and one of the most powerful functions for this tooling approaches that Microsoft probably never envisaged we would use for this exact scenario is concatenate x. So that is an iterative function, and what that's going to do is it's going to traverse my table, and for each entry I'm going to create a rectangle element, and I'm going to bind the stroke width, the fill, the x, the width, the y, the height, using those techniques that we just saw on the previous examples. And because there are, let's say there's 12 rows in 2014, concatenate x is going to go 12 times, and it's going to make one big long piece of text with 12 rectangles in it. And what I like to do, we can specify a delimiter that we put between values. What I like to do is just put Unicode character 13, which is a carriage return. So that helps me to just check everything. And then I order it by that X order to make sure that my bars are actually plotted in and drawn in the right order. And all I do then, all he says, this one's simple compared to some of the others. We just add that marks into our SVG base measure that we're using all the other places. So now if I add that in, if I click on the right table and add that in, and now I get my columns. And I can click on 2013, and because there are less, it stretches them. That might not be desirable, but that's something you can work out. You can actually work out what we would call a step width if you want them to be a specific width. But this just sort of shows us as dynamic. And right now these are independent. So what that means is the highest value for Amarilla is up top, and the highest value for Caratera is up top. And if we hit the synchronized, it's now relative to Paseo, which is the highest valued series. So now we can see the bars relative to the others or not. So this is a decision that you may need to make as a creator. And the Power BI ones, if we add them in, just give you, I have to do a sparkline this way, I think. So if I add a sparkline and I do my month start as my field and I create, it gives me a line because it's a sparkline. But if I change it to a column, we can see it's basically the same as the independent in terms of what it's doing. We don't have the ability to change them to synchronized. So everything is series bound with those.
So click on synchronize so we can see that, just so it draws
totally.
the latest. Yeah.
So this highlights a problem that we now potentially have with this type of chart. So because we're synchronizing, there's some really, really tiny bars. And our technique that we've applied of just putting a stroke around it, like a border, actually takes up some of the space the bar takes up. So if I make that like 1, some of the bars get even smaller and less distinct. If I make it 0, they're all kind of smashed together, but we can start to see some of them creeping back up. So how do we, this is probably the most space we can make use of. Now we can increase the vertical space. Obviously we can make the scale bigger, but how can we make the most of this situation? Well, I'm just going to take the sparkline off and I'll put that back to 0.5. One thing we can think about is the concept of a bandwidth. When I talk about a bandwidth, that is for each amount of space a rectangle should take up, can we scale it to that even more? So the idea being is, even though I've got, say, 12 pixels or whatever for each bar, can I scale it to 80% of that? So this concept here is going to take a parameter called bandwidth and make that 0.8, so 80%. Everything is still the same. The only thing I'm going to do is change I'm going to create a category bandwidth variable that multiplies the derived category width by bandwidth so that we know exactly how wide the bar should be. So we know how wide the category is and how wide the bar is. Then we work out an offset, which is half the difference between them so that we know exactly how many pixels to shove it across so it sits dead in the middle. And then the only other thing we do is just use that category width and bandwidth. We use the bandwidth for the width of the rectangle, and we still use the category width for the X positioning. So that's not a drastic change, but it does make a big difference with some things. So if we add that in, we can now see, let's just zoom in a bit. Hopefully this is going to work. We can now see that we have this spacing that doesn't actually use the stroke around the bar. And there's a couple of places, see if I can zoom, it will help me here, like this one versus this one, where we actually get a bit more definition. And we could start to see a bit more of the shape. So this is something we could use. So I could change that bandwidth dynamically to say 0.5, and it would change the width if I so wish. So I can make these. I can play with the aesthetics of my marks a little bit. So that's just a neat little additional thing that we can add to the top of that. Right. I think we can make it. Going to turn this into a line. And the reason we've been getting you into pixels is because lines need pixels. They don't need percentages. Same approach. The only thing we've done is I've added a fill of transparent. The reason being is that lines will fill in the space they sort of exhibit on the canvas in a really unpredictable way if you don't understand how they're being used. So you might use that if you're producing an area chart, but they have one thing we're going to do with lines is, because lines are quite okay if you take away the 0, areas not so much. We're going to change the category stuff is all the same. We're actually using the center of the category this time, but this is all very much the same. Synchronizing axis is the same. All we're really doing is we're creating what's called a polyline, and I'm defining that as a variable. Oops. And it's got the stroke and the stroke width and the fill, and then there's something called points. So instead of drawing a lot of rectangles, I'm actually using concatenate X. So I'm just going to take a quick drink because I dried up a bit there. There's a lot of syllables to cram in on concatenate X. I'm taking the variables and I'm just building XY pairs. Instead of a whole SVG element, it's just XY pairs, and I'm injecting them into here. So if we add that fellow in, we now get a line, and these are synchronized or independent. They follow the same rules. All we've done is changed a couple of cosmetic things. And what we've done is, as I say, instead of the bandwidth, just trying to find where I've done it, which will be really useful. Category count, category width, category offset. So the category offset, instead of using that difference between the bandwidth and the category, we're just dividing the category width by 2, and that gives us the midpoint. So if I do say divide that by 1, basically leave it where it is, it will shift the lines to the right. It could be to the left as well, but we want to make sure they fit in the middle so that we're using our space as effectively as we possibly can. Now, the one thing about lines is we start to run into clipping issues sometimes with our canvas. I might need to go right in here, but you can see the line in some places gets cut off, and it's not like as nice as it could be. So one thing I would then recommend, and this will help in a number of other ways, which we'll show you, is to think about adding some padding to your canvas. What we will do with padding is it gives us a little bit of white space where we need it, and that stops the clipping. So I'm going to add a padding property here, which I'm just making 2, but I can scale that however I want, but I'm just making it a 2 pixel pad. Now, I'm going to do this on each side of the axis. So the top and the bottom of the y-axis, I'm going to basically push it down by 2 pixels each end, and that's going to stop that clipping. But you need to think about whether you need padding on different sides. So I'm just going to use a generic padding, but you might want to pad left or right and have them differently, or top or bottom, and that's fine. But at the minute, we're just using a single pad. So same approach all the way down. The only difference is where we calculate our scaling for our y-axis. Instead of just using the height, we take away 2 times the padding. So what that's basically going to do is it's going to take 24 and it's going to subtract 4 from it so that we know we've only got 20 pixels of usable height for our y-axis. And then our scale takes that into account as well. So instead of using the full height, that uses the reduced height so that the data fits within that constraint we've put upon it. And the only difference then is our y-axis start uses the height minus the padding. Now, oddly, I think in another measure, I normalized this because we use this anywhere we do the y-axis calculations. Yes, I did y-axis start there. Oh no, y-axis start is normalization. Forget me, it's late. That's to make sure that instead of doing height minus padding on every y value, we just use the reference point for the y-axis start so that it works it out. So when we calculate our 0 value, it's the start position, not the height, minus the scaling that we do. Our primary position approach is the same. The only difference is we use the y-axis start again instead of the height. Points are the same, line is the same, everything else. It's just a little bit of extra scaling that we do to make sure that that works. Now, if I add that measure in, I get a slightly nicer output. Let's just see if I can zoom that in. Scroll bars. Let's come up. There we go. Went in too far. Hopefully we'll be able to see it though. So where we got the issues with the clipping here, you don't get it here because we've just pushed it up another couple of pixels. And that just gives us the ability to it's a little bit of height we're sacrificing, but we get the data in. And this becomes valuable when you want to do things like add markers, because markers will start to clip as well. Speaking of markers, hopefully we've got time to do this one. So what I'm hoping to do is do this one, another one, and then 2 more. We'll keep that one in. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull this one up to show you the finished results, just in case. This is a Stephen Few inspired sparkline. So when I say Stephen Few inspired, we don't have a lot of space. He would normally put that red value, which is the latest value, off to the side and in a bigger font. But I'm just trying to make use of the space we have. And maybe if that changes in future, we can push it out. But what we're doing here is we're using the exact same line from before. We're just compressing it down, and we're finding the highest and lowest values and the latest value, and we're drawing circles for them. And then we're getting the measure values and making labels for them. This gets a little bigger, but the principle is the same. So we're doing our aesthetic properties. We've got our line. We've got our circle markers. So we're saying they're 3 pixels. They've got a fill of this dark gray, and the last one is a different color. What I'm then doing is I'm adding in, for the labels, I have to specify the font family, and this is how, whoops, use the right shape. This is how we need to use it in HTML and CSS. So Segoi UI, which is the typical Power BI font, has a space in it. So we actually have to use this double quote technique, double quote, to make sure that it's encoded properly. And then what I'm doing is I'm using a dynamic font size. So if I change the height, I'm just making about 35% of the height. So each 3 of these sizes can scale based on the height if I change it. The padding, this is the same. The only difference is I've said, because we're adding markers, I want to say get the highest value of the circle radius and the stroke width and add 1 to it, just to give us enough room. So what I mean by that is if I take away 1, you'll see the results there. You see the circles start to clip. So this just makes sure that we give enough space. The only other thing I'm doing is I talked about individual padding. So I'm taking that Y padding concept and I'm applying it to the X-axis as well. So I'm adding a 35 pixel pad to the right. The reason is we need space here. So our data goes along here, and we only want it to fit in there. Otherwise, we don't have room for our labels. So same approach, getting all the values, getting the categories, filtering them out. Same approach to get our X order and our measure values. Minimum value, sync axis stuff all the same. Scaling the Y values, that's all the same. Our line is the same. We haven't changed that. The only approach we're taking is this crazy thing here where we have 3 points of interest. So we want the highest, the lowest, and the latest values. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating 3 table valued variables. Same pattern, but I'm getting the top n descending, the top n ascending based on the measure, and the top n based on the X order. So that's the last one. And they could be the same as the min or the max, but that's okay because we'll draw it last and it will sit over the top. The reason I do this is because each attribute has different properties, because the text is facing text is going different ways. So the baseline for the text is here. And it's here for this one because we're making the most use of our space. So this bottom one hangs down, and this top one gets pushed up so that we can make the most use of it. And this one is middle aligned. So they all have slightly different settings, and then we've got different fill colors and everything else. So this is just to make us, allow us to customize our markers. Then because they're the same shape, I use a union statement to stick them on top of each other. And that makes one big table that we can then go through once with concatenate X, rather than all 3, rather than tripling our code, which we had to do here. We don't have to repeat that lower down. I do one extra step to get the measure formatted how I want it. So that's in millions, rather than, so we have to do that here so it's displayed. Then I use concatenate X to do my circles, my 3 circles. I then do my labels with the same approach, and then I just add them in. So I get 3 drawn on top of each other. So now I can click my
less than 8-point tool. That's the amazing thing for a Power BI person, to look at the small text in Power BI going, yes, yes.
So we can hit our, year. We can see that in some cases the min and the latest and max are the same, but because we draw the max last, it gets drawn over the top. And you could do work to filter out a label if you don't want to, if they're the same or something like that. But this is just to show you how to start thinking about enriching those ideas. So that is, you can play with that a lot more. You can start slicing it and seeing how it works, but time is getting on. The last one I've got was one at Jeff's request. So if we use the sales measure and we create a data bar, I can't do it there, can I? Conditional formatting. There we go. Move that over there. Show bar only. No, let's just do it like it is. Lowest value is 0. So we're adding
the lowest value is 0 automatically, by the way.
What's that?
I'm pretty sure that the lowest value is always 0 automatically.
I think you're right, but this is my, you know, my QA brain is just preventing my, you know, just do it out of habit. So yeah. One of Jeff's common complaints is that you've got this text that sits inside the bar and you kind of get this weird contrast effect. So what I wanted to do is take the example from the end of section 2, this one, but X oriented, and see if we can adjust it a bit. So what we've done is we can take in the principle, same approach mostly. All we've done is add in the padding concept that we talked about. So we need to create some space for a text label. And it's the same thing. We basically just add in a text element, which is offset by that value. And we just do a couple of little things. We nudge it slightly to the right. But ultimately, we get this wrong measure. Oh, dear. Oh, hang on. I know why. I'm using country. That's one thing you got to remember. These things aren't just, they don't just know how you think. So let's take product out of the table and we'll add country in.
Although given enough time, you could code something up that
you could, yeah, you could. It's really just how much you want to put in. Let's put 2014 on. Let's try that measure again. Hey, there we go.
Wow.
So this now gives us the ability to have a more compact but ultimately richer approach. So you can start to layer these things up and think really hard about how you want your visuals to look. The one I'll just do a couple of bonus ones if that's all right, Jeff. I'll just whiz through them. I won't talk them through. I will make this workbook available, but it may be a couple of days just because I had to prep for this thing and I was more focused on delivering the content than the workbook. But I will make this available and I'll pass it to Jeff. And hopefully he can share that link with you. I'll just, one neat little thing I've been playing with is the idea of, even though this is a square one, just something a little different, a waffle chart. So that's just using a percentage measure and animation as well. So you can shade the area based on how much of a percent is taking it up. And that trick is, it doesn't take a lot of code, actually, surprising. It's all variables for my grid coordinates, 10 by 10. How my interval is so each waffle item is 1%. So I could change that as well if I wanted it to be 5% or something like that. Make a total grid size 10 by 10. Then use generate series to create a 100-row table based on my interval and grid configuration. And then I have this column called inverse, which runs the order backwards because Y is backwards. So this just it goes from 0 to 99 because we're 0 based, and I just have an inverse which goes 99 to 0 in the same row. What I then do is I work out the X, Y coordinates based on the grid sizes. So, you know, 0, 1, 0, 2s, and so on and so forth. Work out which row we're on. So I construct this up. I work out my percentage. So I'm just timing that by 100 because I'm using percentages. I've got a sort. And I'm just basically doing a similar thing. I've got my base SVG. The difference here is I've put a token in and I'm doing a sub because I'm leaving it out of the total. So I'm using a has one value to ignore it out of the total because otherwise we just get, I mean, you might want to waffle with it all filled in. I don't know. But this is basically just doing the same thing. Concatenate X, use the grid coordinates table, 10 by 10. Draw a rectangle for each one, make it 1 wide. And the trick here is I am using the viewbox that I hinted about before. So with viewbox, even though we've got a physical width and height, we can specify a coordinate system inside our SVG. And I'm making that the same as grid X and grid Y. So that one unit of these creates a rectangle that fills basically that value. So when I change the grid, my viewbox changes. I won't demo that because demo gods and all that, but it does work. And then the other thing you can do is put animations inside elements. So you can change attributes over time and make them do stuff. So this is just a really simple thing that changes the width and height from 0 to 1 over about half a second. just so that I mean, it's not the most, I mean, I'm not good at coming up with animations, but it just shows that they grow. When you click on the, we can change that to say 1.5 seconds. And that will just grow a little bit slower. So if you like the idea of animations, what you've got to remember is the visual redraws every time. So you can't have it move from one previous state to the other. It has to always start from as if it's being drawn for the first time. The other one, which I would love to go into, and I will probably write a blog post about, is kernel density estimation. So one use case I've got here is I've got a load of locations around New Zealand, and I've got a load of temperature samples totaling 683,000. And what this is what's called a kernel density plot, which is showing the distribution. It's like a smooth histogram across all the data that we have. So I'm traversing over 500,000 rows, and I'm using this technique to, you can see how fast that was. It's one of the things I start to appreciate about DAX, is that I can slice and dice this data, and it's calculating these distributions on the fly. So you can see that now I've got Jan and July. We've got what we call multimodal distribution, where we've got peaks in different places because the temperature samples are quite different at those times of year. We've also got the ability to play with what we call bandwidth. So with bandwidth, we talked about that chart bandwidth. You can look at how wide each part of this histogram is. If we get that wrong, we can sometimes lose that multimodality, but we've also got an auto value that works it out. If we put it down to 0, it works it out. And sampling is kind of smoothness. So this actually makes the measures more intense. It actually produces way more rows under the hood, but we can actually do, considering you can see that the lines are a bit sharper there. But this is running a lot of DAX under the hood, and it's been quite impressive actually what the DAX folks have done to make my horrible DAX work as fast as it does. But I could go on and on and on. What I do want to do very, very quickly is say there are people that are probably a little more gentle than I am at introducing you to SVG. So there's Laura Graham-Brown. She's got a whole guide to SVG in Power BI. She's recently done a new video. David Eldersveld, who did the sparklines we saw at the beginning, he has a series as well. Kerry Glasgow, who is great in this space, she's got some templates that already show some of the ideas she's been putting out. So I'll just add that. It's like I had to double paste in the chat. Kerry also did a video the other day. And there's also Christine Payton, who is doing quite a lot in Power BI at the moment. She's also got a video that shows a bullet chart. So I'm just going to pop that in the chat as well. I am going to stop there because I'm conscious that it's nearly 7:30. I appreciate your patience. What would you like? Have you got questions? Do you want to like lynch me? What would you like?
I've got some amazing comments. I mean, a lot of love in the chat. I've been playing around with these things for a week, and there's a whole bunch of stuff there that I didn't know or hadn't considered. So I just wanted to say thanks very much, because I learned a heck of a lot, including the idea of using Unicar 13 for debugging. You wouldn't believe how many times I've been looking at long elements of code and wishing it was nicely formatted, but never thought to put that in there. I thought that bandwidth idea was fantastic. That idea, that ability to center sparklines was new to me. I hadn't thought about that. But most of all, I learned, but I've forgotten, I learned how to pronounce Segui.
Segui.
Segui, thank you. I mean, it was worth showing up just for that, Daniel.
Thank you, Jeff. I just have one quick thing. Did we want to talk about tooltips? I forgot to mention that.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, sorry. I did promise I would talk about them. Just share my screen again real quick. On the right screen now. There we go. So if we just go back to say the, let's go back to the bars. No, the sparks, that'll do. So we noticed we got this tooltip that shows the underlying SVG. So this is not desirable. It's great for debugging, but it's not desirable. At the moment, there's not really an eloquent way to deal with it. So the recommendation would be, there's a couple of things actually. So I posted about this, and a couple of people, I'm going to really forget, I think it was David Bacci, who is doing some cool stuff with Deneb and helping a lot of people out in the community. He'd suggested what you can do you've got a couple options. If you don't want a tooltip at all on your table, you can turn tooltips on. So you get this, which is not any better, but you can actually set the background to 100% transparent, and you now don't get tooltips. The alternative, and what would probably be the correct thing to do, is to use report page tooltips. So instead, build a nice tooltip that shows up when you go over the page, over the data point. So there's a couple of options there. What I would love to see is if we could get some more control, because with SVG you can build an alternative text in, and actually with oops, this is the wrong visual. No, that's, where are we looking? There we go. There is an accessibility option that's come up. So this is one thing we haven't talked about because I'm trying to cram so much in, is accessibility. Obviously, this is not very accessible. We do have the ability to add alt text as well. That doesn't mean it comes up as a tooltip, but for a screen reader, it can be a lot more user-friendly. So if you build these great things, still think about having a column or a measure that could give a screen reader a nice description underneath. So I think that's covered off everything I wanted to say about that. I will yield the floor again.
Excellent. Another thought that that I may be able to share something with you. I noticed that David Outersveld wraps a lot of his elements in a int, so they don't get too long. So because SVG is returning text, and there must be a text limit. It must performance.
It's a couple of million characters.
Okay, great.
Chris Webb has a blog on it.
If you don't do that, I don't know.
That's a good question. So one of the challenges you have, you're drawing a lot of elements. So it's like putting visuals on a page, and it's a similar thing to think about Deneb as well, visuals like that, where you're putting a lot of marks onto the canvas. This is the same problem. So I'm working on a rain cloud plot, which is like a density plot, box plot, jitter plot. And you can really slow things down if you've got a lot of data points. So you can go to a couple of million characters with output, but you do have to think about performance as well. So try and keep that output fairly minimal.
Excellent. Anybody on the other than me have questions or comments that they'd like to raise at this stage?
Just a very quick comment from me, if I may. Daniel, just really appreciate the nice, steady, progressive way you explain things. It gives us a really strong sense of what is possible by others like yourself, not necessarily by us, but no, it's really appreciated.
Thank you. It's something that I do get concerned about, because this is a really, hopefully it'll become less esoteric. But it was, I was very conscious that we're hitting you with a lot of stuff very quickly, and because you're drawing everything yourself, there's so much to think about, and there's all these gotchas. So I really appreciate that. And it's funny, because I was saying to Jeff that I was getting really stressed about this, because it turned into way more work than I thought, because it was like a week ago. He said, do you want to show a few examples? And I said, oh yeah, I'll do that. And then I thought about it, and I thought, well, that's not it may give people some assurance that this stuff's possible, but I'd love you to go away and be able to start thinking this way. So I'm really, really glad to hear, Jerry. Thank you.
Yeah, another point is that a lot of this code can easily be amended to your own use. So you don't necessarily need to know how it works. You can just, and there'll be more and more code like this that's well commented, where you can just do a find and replace your measures with the measures in the code with the measures that you've got. So you
Awesome.
don't need to know how it all works, but it helps if you want to make up something that doesn't exist.
Yeah, I'm just really, if I want to give somebody something to use, I like to think that it's fairly easy to change. But if you want to dig into the details, I do try and explain where my head's at, and also because somebody else may find a better way to do it, and then they can just swap that bit out and maybe tell me and say, hey, this thing you did, this is a better way of doing it, and then I get better at DAX, because I really cannot emphasize how bad I am at DAX. I'm amazed I did this much in a week.
It's just like that sparkline scaling, it's all relative, mate. Excellent. If anyone's interested, I can, for 1 minute, I can share my screen and show you what I've done with this stuff over the last week. Phil's not.
Yes, please. There you go. So I would love to see it.
Let me just work out where my screen is. Where's share screen window or tab? Sorry. Share. Sorry. It's funny. It's not sharing yet.
It's coming through.
Is it? You can see the.
Right, I can see SVG driven sparklines. I can show you.
Great. So this is just an example of, you can do area charts as well, which is something that Power BI doesn't do natively. So like Daniel, you know, we've got the ability to scale these things individually or relative to each other. Here we're actually looking at populations of names over the last 120 years. So you can get some real cool looks of these things. But the other kind of thing I've had fun with this week is working out how to do a column chart with this. So I'll just boost this up a bit so you can see it a bit better. So here we have, you know, a 2-column column chart that, if I just put it on unisex, we can see for a particular year the distribution of names between male and female for unisex names. So really, you can do a heck of a lot of stuff. If you dream, it's almost if you can dream it, you can do it, right? It's really cool. It's the ability to do multicolor, multi-series sparklines has long been a dream of mine. And thanks to the Power BI team for changing the scaling of images in these matrices so that we can actually get the aspect ratio right and tell a compelling story using.
Jeff, on that, I found my email that I sent an email back in 2018 to Will Thompson saying this is what we need to do. So this is how far back it actually goes. This was prior to me starting at Microsoft. I was bugging them about getting that aspect ratio correct.
Anecdotally, I was looking at trying to get on the contributor program to do this feature in not long after that.
Oh yeah, COVID and all that. But of course, you guys are missing the actual proper use of SVG in Power BI. The obvious use, and that is games, 3D gaming. That's what it was actually intended for, surely. Which again makes use of your custom visual, you know, where you can actually just render the SVG inside an HDMI visual, and you can go nuts and do all sorts of interesting things with slices and filters on the outside to render more than just circles and rectangles, or actually just still render circles and rectangles, but in a more interesting way. So you can go nuts, and I have done. So I'm not recommending it.
But it looks so good.
Daniel, for your time. It was a heck of an effort given a week. Don't you set yourself such a short target again in future. When someone offers you a 5-minute spot, take it. But it was
yes, Jeff.
We learned so much. I look forward to unpacking it and stealing some of the code.
Awesome.
Thanks to everybody for showing up. It's fantastic to have so many people from all over the community here and Wellington virtually to see what we're producing out of this amazing little country of ours, you know. So we look forward to seeing you next month. Next month we won't do it on the Tuesday because it's Anzac Day here. It's like a, how would you describe Anzac Day? Almost like a Veterans Day or something like that in a way for those of you from the States. So we'll probably do it on the Wednesday or the Thursday, and we're in the process of lining up presenters. But we look forward to seeing you all in just over a month. And as soon as Daniel's book is with me at PBIX file, I will share it, and the video will be up in a couple of days as well. So just
no worries.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
No, thank you. It's been great, and it was nothing more fun than to sort of panic put this together because I learned a lot as well. So it was really good, and thank you everybody for coming. I will write that workbook up a bit more.